The passage of Scripture I'll be reading from is John 11:32 through 38. And while this is a short reading, it's very impactful in the sense that there is a physical act that happens in this passage that is very, very uncommon for us to be a witness of. So I hope that's not, so I'll just say, please pay careful attention and resonate on that with your mind. John 11:32. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it.
Well, Dave is right about there being a lot happening in this text. That's the reason why we're here this morning. If you want to open up to John chapter 11 and the text that he just read from, I'll tell you what's happening. Last Sunday morning, we talked about the resurrection of Lazarus. Last Sunday night, we talked about the different reactions to that story. And so we talked about Martha's reaction, Mary's reaction. We talked about the Jews who came and had a positive reaction and the Jews who came and had a negative reaction. And so when I was making my notes for that class, I also had Jesus' reaction to that thing. And in doing my reading and putting my notes together, what I saw was there are just as many notes on Jesus' reaction as there are for Martha and Mary, the good Jews and the bad Jews. And so this is just a continuation of last week's where we're talking about reactions and Jesus' feelings, reactions to this story. Just two things before we get started, real quick. Ed, I think you have announcements today. I sent you a text with an extra one. Kevin, this is not for you all. This is Ryan failed, so I need to try and do it now real quick. I have a video in this lesson with sound, and I meant to try and work that out beforehand, so good luck. If it doesn't work, it's no problem, but that sound box back there is a giant mystery to me, and every time I do something like this, I have to turn every knob to see which one it is, so it's coming. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Anyway, okay. So Dave read our text for us, which is right there behind us. If you want to take organized notes, this is what we're about to do. We're going to look at Jesus' reaction to this situation. And I say this situation because there is Lazarus, his friend, has died. Martha and Mary, people that he loves, are very upset because their brother has just died. There's a group of mourners who are very upset and mourning with them. And so all of this is happening. And not only that, Eric Awad gave me some language for this last week. He called it this raising Lazarus from the dead, he referred to as the terminal event that led to his crucifixion. That's great language. This is the thing, and Jesus knows this is the thing. And so imagine all of these emotions piled into a bowl and what's going on here in this situation. And so if you want to take organized notes, what we're going to do is we're going to look at three different things that are said about the emotions. And just like most of my lessons, this is kind of the way that my lessons normally go. First, we're going to look at the data. We're going to look at the information, see if we can understand and get that information in our head. Then at the end of the lesson, we're going to say, what's the point for me? What does any of this mean? What am I going to take away from it? So that's kind of where I intend to go this morning. Number one, In verse 33, when Jesus saw her married, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved. Now, this is the reason why I do reading before every lesson. You can't pour out unless you have something to pour out. And so every time I teach a class or do a lesson, it always starts with reading. I have to learn what's going on here myself before I can share with you what's going on here. And one of the things that I learned about this that I don't think I would have ever had any clue about, and you'll see this for yourself. If you have a study Bible right now, or if you have a commentary on the Gospel of John, test me on this and see if it's true. When you come to these words that Jesus was deeply moved, you're going to see that people write paragraphs about that. And one of the reasons why is because this is perfect for me. I'm not very good at emotions, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of dwelling on this text, because reading about it and seeing examples of it and learning about it kind of helps me to understand myself and what's happening in here when I don't have any idea what's going on. And so I'm reading about this word and why it's such a big deal. There's a couple things that I want to share with you about this. Number one, if you want to make a note about this, I think you want to say two things about it. Number one is that you want to focus heavily on the deeply part of this. There's a difference between being moved by something and being deeply moved by something. And the reason why this word is such a big deal is because it is emphasizing that Jesus is not just feeling in this situation. You could say this: Jesus is really feeling in this situation. And that's something that we have to see. That's one of the things that this word gives us. Here is a definition for you from Lowe and Nida. To have an intense, strong feeling of concern. And then listen to this. So that's number one, is going to be the deepness of it, the intensity of it. But also, this is a second thing you're going to want to note about this word, is it doesn't just convey the thought of deep emotion, really big emotion. It also carries with it the idea of anger or indignation. That's why people are going to really want to talk about what's going on here, because you can understand Lazarus has died. Mary, he looks over at this woman that he loves, and she's really upset because her brother has just died. And Jesus feels deeply about it. We're cool until we get to that this word carries with it a sense of anger and indignation with it also. And so this is the rest of that definition, often with the implication of indignation. And so if you have a Bible with marginal notes in your English Standard Version, it's going to say that Jesus was deeply moved, but there's a note next to that word that says, or, here's another way to treat it, he was indignant. This is from the Net Bible Notes. In addition, this sorrow was intermixed with anger. And that's the case. You can see it in a couple different Bibles. Mike, do you have your CSB Holman Christian Bible with you today? Mike sometimes carries the Christian Standard Bible, which says this. It doesn't say he was deeply moved. Mike's Bible that he carries sometimes says this: he was angry in his spirit. And the Message is also going to do that. A deep anger welled up within him, which really causes me, and I'm not alone, this is why so many people have written so much about this. How does that work? That Jesus is in this situation and he feels deeply, but part of the deep emotion that he feels is not only sorrow but anger. And this is where I have my video, Kevin, if you're ready, because it's silly. I know that it's silly. But this is one of the truest and best illustrations of this that I've ever seen in my life. It's from a cartoon that I watch with my kids called Home. It's about an alien who is lost in Earth, and I don't remember the plot, trying to get home, but the alien talks funny, and it's a really funny movie, but it's really good. This part is really good. And watch, this is the alien, which is often me, trying to figure out this girl's emotions. And he's trying to explain emotions that are almost impossible to explain.
So, you're my mom.
Maybe no sound.
Is a very important human person to you. More important than others. To not belong with her causes you being sad. But recent moments ago, you are kicking on me and yelling, which is seeming more to be mad than sad.
Well, sometimes it's both.
So, you are sad mad.
That's it. Sad mad. That's the best word that I can think of to illustrate what's going on here. This deep feeling that Jesus has at this situation. This alien looks at Jesus and says, what's going on here? Somebody that you love and their family have died and you're really upset, but you're also mad. What is it? Explain it to me. He's sad mad was the best way to do it. And I got to tell you, man, this hits me really hard because I've said this to several of you right now. I'm not very good at my own emotions, and I admit that readily. One of the situations that Becky and I have been walking through, and we're not alone in this, is watching somebody that we love very much walk away from the Lord and the Lord's people. And it sends me into this thing where I don't know what to feel. I feel something, but it's mostly a combination of two things. One is that I deeply love this person, and to watch them walk away creates sorrow inside of me. But also, I think that it's fair to describe it almost as like a rage. How could you do this? And not only how could you do this, but the destruction that you're going to create among God's people when you decide to do this thing. And I feel it right now. I feel like I want to cry, but I also feel like I want to punch somebody. And I don't know what to do with that. And that is the thing that I think that we're reading about with Jesus here, if you're going to understand the sense of not only deep sorrow, but also anger and indignation at the situation. We'll talk more in just a second about what. What was he mad about? What was he sad about in those circumstances? Number two, here's a good description of that. Number 2 in verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved. We talked about that one. It says he was deeply moved in his spirit. And number 2, it says that he was greatly troubled. There's a couple things that I want to read through on this. John chapter 12 and verse 27 is another place where you're going to see the word deeply troubled. And I would like for you to really pay special attention to this, because at the end of this lesson, we're going to come back to this one. Jesus is deeply moved and greatly troubled here. In verse 27, if you want a picture of that, he's about ready to be arrested and crucified, and he knows it. In verse 27 of John chapter 12 says, "Now is my soul troubled." It's that word. "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I have come to this hour." And so Jesus, thinking about the things that are about to happen to him, explains what's happening in his mind and his heart and his soul by saying, "I am very troubled right now." Those are the words to describe it. There's a psalm that I have noted next to this. Psalm chapter 6. In Psalm 6, David often explains his emotions in this way. In Psalm chapter 6, verse 1 through 4, especially in verse 3, I think that you see the sense here that if you want to try and put words to feelings. Psalm 6, starting in verse 1, O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Now listen to this. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul is also greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, and then at the dash is like this. My bones are troubled. My soul is troubled. And then he says, but you, O Lord, and it's like, I don't know what to say. Dash. And he goes, how long, O Lord? You ever been there where you're just like, I don't know. How long are we going to do this? That I have to feel like this. And then verse 4 it says, turn, O Lord, deliver my life. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. Here's a little comment about that greatly troubled and diving into the depth of this word here. While capturing the anguish experienced by the psalmist, it does not bring out sharply enough the sense of terror associated with the expression. Elsewhere, the word translated in agony, my bones are in agony right now. In other places, that same word is rendered terrified out of my senses. If you want to understand it, like, I am greatly troubled right now. What does that mean? Scared out of my mind doesn't do it. You have to do the word terror. Like, there's a deepness of the feeling that we're describing here. Here it describes not just the agonizing pain of illness and disease, but the suffocating fear that can attend deteriorating life force and loss of control. What am I going to do? There's nothing that I can do. I don't know what to do. That's the feeling. At the very core, in the bones, fear has taken root that threatens to undo the psalmist. Look at chapter 13 and verse 21. John chapter 13 and verse 21. If you want to see one more on this one, the heading above this section is one of you will betray me. So he's thinking about what's going to happen with Judas. In verse 21, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit. And he testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. Just think about that for a second. Look around this building and think about the person who's closest to you, someone in your inner circle. And then think, that person is about to stab me right in the back and betray me. And then that feeling that you have in thinking about it, that's this. There's Jesus. Number one, he's deeply moved. Number two, he's greatly troubled. And then number three, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. We have to talk about Jesus weeping because if you will think back to the very start of this gospel, and when we started, I think 28 lessons ago, we read in John chapter 1 and verse 1 that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We're talking about the creator of all things, through whom God created the trees, the sky, the planets, the animals, you and me, all things, the creator of all things, who knows all things and has a power to accomplish all things. He sees the end of the road. Get that picture in your mind of who the Jesus is that we're talking about here, and then imagine him sitting amongst his friends in a sad situation, just crying with them. It's hard. It's not hard for me to imagine that emotion. It's hard for me to imagine that emotion coming from God, coming from Jesus, the one through whom the entire universe was created. So there's those three things. It's information, just information, these words. Deeply moved, greatly troubled, Jesus wept. Get a sense of that emotion. I think before we get to the point, this is another thing that I was not expecting from my preparation in this lesson, and that's just why. Why did he feel sorrow, indignation, anger, rage, sadness, weeping. The idea of Jesus weeping is quiet weeping. If you go back, you can see, I should have said this earlier, where's our verse here? Verse 34 says, "Where have you laid them?" And they said, "Lord, come and see." Oh, maybe I need to go back to verse 33. It says, "When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping," that's not the same word as Jesus is weeping. What's happening with Mary and the Jews who are with her is a word that really implies the sound. Probably a better word to go with that would be wailing. Ah! Jesus, that word just implies the tears, almost like a quiet sadness. So here's the emotion and why is it there? And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this. I just want to throw it out to you because I think it's interesting, and I think it helps to pin down the emotion that's sometimes hard to explain. Yeah, I mean, he feels this way because he just lost a friend. Earlier in the text, we find out that Lazarus was somebody that Jesus loved, and so that's not hard to explain. I saw a couple things that I think are just stupid. I can't go along with this. I have 3 notes from commentators, and I'll just read one of them on this one, that Jesus was crying because he lost a friend that he loved, Lazarus. Whatever the combination of these terms mean, it cannot be said that Jesus was shaken by the death of Lazarus since he had predicted it. Well, I predict that some of you are going to die in my lifetime, and that doesn't make me any less sad about it, knowing that it's going to happen. I know that it's going to happen, and I can predict the future and see, hey, if the Lord doesn't come back, our whole church family and, within this congregation, some people that we love very much are going to die. And we know that that's true, that people that we love very much are going to die. But just because we know it doesn't mean it's not going to be awful when it happens. So everybody wants to say, no, he wasn't crying because he lost a friend. He knew it was going to happen. And it's like, well, that doesn't change anything, knowing that it's going to happen. Number 2, he's not just crying because he lost a friend. He's crying because people that he loved have lost their brother, and they're also sad. I think that the environment really adds to this. Here's a commentator. It was the habit in the day to express grief in a noisy, unrestrained fashion. And this is what these mourners were doing, and Jesus is surrounded by this. And I think there's people here. I'll get in trouble for calling this person out, but Julia, Julia is what we would call a contagious crier. She doesn't have to be sad. She doesn't even have to know what you are sad about. But if you're upset and crying, she's going to start crying. She might start crying now since I'm talking about it. But that's this sort of a thing, It's not just that I have lost this person that I love. It's that you have lost this person that you love, and I love you. And this is kind of the idea that Paul talked about, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I'm sad with you. So why is Jesus feeling all of these feelings? That's an option. I wonder if this has something to do with it. This is me just being me, I'm sure, on this one. Look back at verse 33. The sentence happens right after verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, listen to this, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled, and then Jesus weeps. And so I feel this one personally. Mary's going out to meet Jesus. My guessing is from earlier in the section, look at verse 28. When she had said this, she went and Martha called her sister Mary, saying, in private, the teacher is here calling for you. And when she heard of it, she rose up quickly and went out. And in verse 31, when the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly to go out, they followed her. And this might be a little bit of the anger understanding. Here's Mary just trying to go out and see his friend Jesus, and you got this crowd of people following her around in her grief when she's trying to mourn and talk with her friends. At least, I'm not saying this has to be the reason, but at least add it to the mix of why Jesus is feeling the things that he's feeling here. One option that I saw a lot of was general anger and sadness at disbelief overall. And so the sense would be Jesus is surrounded by people that he loves and people that he's been teaching now for more than at least a year, probably more than 2 years at this point. I think we could say certainly more than 2 years at this point. And they're faced with this grief and they're wailing. And maybe Jesus' response is something like, haven't you been listening to anything that I said this whole time? It kind of goes along with this. Before you think that I'm insensitive for thinking this, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13 says this, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. Be sad about it. We lost somebody that we love. Be sad about it. But this is what Paul says, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. So we grieve like other people grieve, but not in the same way that they grieve, because we know that death is not the end for God's people. And maybe this is a part of it. You know, maybe Jesus is frustrated at this situation. Only a couple more here. Maybe Jesus is just generally mad at sin that has created this mess in the entire world in the first place. I'll tell you what, that's one that I felt when we lost Dad in October. I still am not able to say with words, me not being very good with emotions things, but I'm not really good at putting words to it. But one of the things that I think that I would try and articulate that I felt, it's not just sadness at his loss or madness at the cancer, you know, that we did for a whole year. And I know that you all feel some of that too. It's just like, sometimes I just really hate this world. That's it. Sometimes it just stinks. Everybody stinks. The whole situation just stinks. That we have to live this and do this every day. It's a general. You don't hate Satan any more than when you watch the consequences of what he has created. And I think that this is an appropriate place to add anger into sorrow as we're thinking through some of these different things. We could talk about each one of these for a long time. I got two more. Cindy Awad offered this one. She said she got it from D. Bowman in a sermon one time. Maybe Jesus was sorry and mad and upset to bring Lazarus back. I mean, that's a thought. He's with our Father in heaven, Abraham's bosom. And in order to do this thing, you know, I got to bring him back to this place, and I don't want him to have to do that. It's an option. And this is the last one, you know, maybe part of the whole thing. I think this should probably be sprinkled over top of all the things, is that Jesus knows good and well that this death and suffering that he's dealing with right now is what he himself is about to endure. In just like a couple pages, flipping through the story. I just never would have thought in coming to the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, and that he was deeply moved and greatly troubled, that there was so much to be said. And Dave got up here and he said, there's a lot here. Yeah, there is a lot in these verses to think about. Here's the last thing that we'll do this morning. Let's just think about the so what. Okay, here we have our information. And now what am I going to take away from it? I think that I have at least 3 things. There are probably more that it's not fair for me to limit it to 3, but there are 3 things that come to the very front of my mind as I think through this. Go over to Genesis 6 with me, if you will. I don't know why. I'm not sure that I've ever noticed this in Genesis chapter 6. Last week we talked about how people that Jesus loves are allowed to suffer in this world. That's something that we know. It just doesn't mean we like it, but we know it. It's true. But one of our takeaways is to know that when we suffer and while we suffer, God the Father and Jesus the Son are suffering right alongside with us. I'm not sure that's going to make anything any better for anyone in this room, but it's important that you know it. I saw this, I've always thought with the story of the flood in Genesis chapter 6, when I read this story and think about God's reaction to this story, it says in verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. In verse 6, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth. And that's almost always where I stop. That's the comment that I always make in talking about this. Imagine God creating humanity, looking down at the world in Noah's day and saying, I wish that I had not done this. That's the feeling of regret that I always pay attention to, but that's not the end of the sentence. And I'm sure that I've read the end of the sentence multiple times, but until now I've never really, I don't think, processed it. It says that he regretted that he had made man on the earth, and then it goes on and it says, and it grieved him to his heart. So it's not just that God watches his people suffer. It's that he often suffers alongside us, with us, in the midst of our suffering. It's nice to have contagious criers and people who feel our feelings, but to imagine that one of those is God. If you think about Jesus in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, Isaiah 53 is that passage that sometimes people read when we're talking about the Lord's Supper. And this is one of the things that it says about Jesus in verse 3, that he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. In describing who Jesus is, one of the things that you have to say about him is that he knows the grief that I feel. And he understands it. He lives it. That's the point of Hebrews. In fact, I'm going to go there. Hebrews chapter 2. There's 3 different passages in Hebrews that I want to read through right now. I won't spend all this amount of time on all of these different points, but just this one, because this is the one that means the most to me. Hebrews chapter 2 and verses 17 and 18. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. The Hebrew writer is making the point that Jesus is a perfect mediator for us, because he's able to look at us in whatever our emotions and circumstances in life are, except sin, and say, I know what that feels like. I did that too. I've been there. Hebrews chapter 4 and verses 15 and 16. Hebrews 4 verses 15 and 16. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. He says, I know what that's like. In Hebrews chapter 5 and verses 7 and 8, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. You know that feeling that you feel? Praying to God, begging God with crying and tears? Jesus says, hey, I did that too. I know what that's like. And so, number one, if you want to take anything from this lesson, you know, I would think it should be this. And I'll tell you what, I'm not even sure why it should be this. Why do you think that, Ryan? I don't know. I just think it's important to know that when we suffer, Jesus is there suffering alongside us. One more thing, just because we were talking about it on Thursday, and this crossed my mind in that conversation. In Genesis 46, when God is saying, you're going to go down into Egypt, and you know what's going to happen to the Jewish people whenever they go down into Egypt? One of the things that God says is, you're going to go down to Egypt, and he says, and I'm going to go with you. worth knowing. Number 2, we don't have to grieve as those who have no hope. 1 Thessalonians 4:13, we read it just a second ago. We do not want you to be uninformed, that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. Go back to John chapter 14 with me. Remember a second ago when we were talking about how Jesus was greatly troubled? And I said, pay attention to this word because we're going to come back to it in just a second. We're there now. Jesus was greatly troubled. He was thinking about his death. He was greatly troubled. He was talking about how Judas was about to betray him. He was greatly troubled. Look at where else that word is used. John chapter 14 and verse 1, Jesus says to his followers, let not your hearts be troubled. There's another one I think that we should probably say before commenting on it. Verse 27, he says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Jesus did the suffering so that we don't have to be afraid of it. At the end of every lesson, there's an invitation. And the invitation is something like, if you have the faith that we've been describing in Bible class, if you believe Jesus and you're willing to hand your life over to him in the ways that he said to do that, we say, come forward as we stand and sing the invitation. This is the invitation. Jesus did the greatly troubled thing and suffered through it to give you an out. So you don't have to have the same worry that he had of experiencing the things that he experienced. And then finally, number 3, this quote really grabbed my attention. To those who follow Jesus as his disciples today, would do well to learn the same tension, that grief and compassion without outrage reduce to mere sentiment, while outrage without grief hardens into self-righteous arrogance and irascibility. And the lesson is, we look at Jesus and how he felt for other people and with other people, and we say, that's supposed to be what we do with each other. And so as you suffer, my responsibility is to suffer alongside you and to be with you. And maybe I'm not able to put any words to it at all. My joke, and I make it a joke because if it's not a joke, then it's just me being pathetic. But my joke is I never know. Every time I'm around a girl who cries, my response is, I don't know what to do right now. And so, my universal thing with Becky is I don't know what the words are, but the thing that you're feeling, I'm with you while you're feeling it. That's it. That's it. That's our responsibility. Sometimes it might be best to just not say anything anyway. And so if you are here today and you're not a Christian, I think the takeaway from this lesson, as we learn more about God and who he is and what he's like, and his son Jesus and who he is and what he's like and what that means for us, our main takeaway is something like this. He looks at your soul and he sees that you're lost, and he feels so deeply about that. Rage at the devil for causing it, sadness at the loss of one of his people, that he gave his own life to buy you back out of that death. And if you're ready to do something about that today, come forward, let us know as we stand and sing the invitation song.